Welcome, brave souls, to our first tale of terror today. We're venturing deep into the heart of the wilderness, where ancient legends come to life and shadows hide more than just darkness. Our first story takes us to the remote forests of Romania, a place rich in folklore and mystery, where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurs. But don't worry, this is just the beginning. There are more chilling stories to come as we continue. Before we dive into this spine-tingling tale, let me ask you, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. And trust me, you'll want to stick around until the very end because what you're about to hear will make you think twice about ever going camping again. Let's get started. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when a group of 5 friends arrived at the edge of Balia Lake, nestled in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. The area was known for its breathtaking beauty, with towering peaks and dense forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. The friends, Tom, Sarah, Mike, Lily, and Chris, had been planning this camping trip for months, eager to escape the bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. As they set up their tents near the lake's edge, the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows over the campsite. The air grew cooler, and the forest around them seemed to come alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. It was peaceful, yet there was an undercurrent of something else, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Tom, the group's unofficial leader, suggested they gather around the campfire to share stories as night fell. The flames danced in the wind, casting flickering light across their faces as they huddled closer for warmth. It wasn't long before the conversation turned to local legends, and Mike, always the joker, began to recount tales of the Yeti, the Chupacabra, and other infamous creatures. But it was Sarah who silenced the group with a story that sent shivers down their spines. "You've all heard of the Strigoi, right?" she asked, her voice low and serious. The others nodded. The Strigoi were a well-known legend in Romania, undead spirits who rose from their graves to drink the blood of the living. But Sarah wasn't talking about the Strigoi. She leaned in closer, her eyes wide with fear. "This isn't about the Strigoi. This is about something far worse. It's about the creature that haunts these very woods, the Moroi." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The Moroi was a lesser-known legend, a malevolent spirit that, unlike the Strigoi, was not content to simply feed on the living. The Moroi was said to possess the bodies of the living, driving them to madness and unspeakable acts of violence. And it was said to dwell in the deepest parts of the Carpathian forests, waiting for the unsuspecting to wander too close. "People say the Moroi can't be killed," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not like a vampire that can be staked or burned. The Moroi is a force, an entity that can move from person to person, leaving death and destruction in its wake." The others listened in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the darkness around them deepening as Sarah's words sank in. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply, and a thick fog began to roll in from the lake, slowly creeping over the campsite. The friends pulled their jackets tighter around themselves, feeling the cold seep into their bones. The fire crackled and popped, struggling to stay alive against the encroaching dampness. Lily, who had been quietly listening to Sarah's story, suddenly shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. She looked around, her eyes scanning the darkened woods that surrounded them. "Do you guys feel that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Feel what?" Tom asked, his voice slightly tense, as if he already knew the answer. "It's like, we're being watched," Lily replied, her eyes wide with fear. The others fell silent, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. But the usual night noises, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, had all but disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness that made their skin crawl. Chris, the most skeptical of the group, tried to laugh it off. "Come on, guys, it's just the story getting to us. There's nothing out there." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The fog had thickened, and it seemed to swirl unnaturally around the edges of the campsite, as if it were alive, pressing in on them, closing off any chance of escape. Suddenly, there was a loud snap from the woods, like a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. The group jumped, their hearts pounding in their chests. Mike grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the sound, the beam cutting through the fog like a knife. The light revealed nothing but trees and shadows, but the oppressive feeling didn't go away. "We should go inside the tents," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's just an animal, but it doesn't feel right out here." No one argued. They quickly doused the fire, their movements hurried and nervous, and retreated to the safety of their tents. But even inside, with the fabric walls between them and the night, the sense of unease lingered. Every rustle of the wind against the tents, every creak of the trees, felt like something far more sinister. Lying in the darkness, none of them could sleep. They listened intently, their ears straining for any sound that might explain the strange feeling that had settled over them. And then, just as they were beginning to think they had imagined it all, a soft, rhythmic tapping began to echo through the campsite. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the fog. The sound grew louder, closer, as if whatever was out there was circling the tents, watching, waiting. Tom, unable to bear it any longer, unzipped his tent just enough to peek outside. The fog was so thick that he could barely see a few feet in front of him, but the tapping continued, coming from just beyond his line of sight. He held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest, as the footsteps paused right outside his tent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension unbearable. Tom waited, his eyes wide, every muscle in his body tensed, but nothing happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he zipped the tent back up and lay down, his body trembling with fear. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour, but no one dared to move or speak. Whatever had been out there was gone, for now. But they all knew, deep down, that the night was far from over. Morning came, but the sun's light barely penetrated the thick blanket of fog that still clung to the campsite. The group emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and tense from the restless night. The forest seemed quieter than before, unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. No one spoke of the strange sounds they had heard during the night, but the fear in their eyes said enough. Tom, always the leader, suggested they pack up and leave early. Something about the place felt wrong, and the sooner they got out, the better. But as they began to gather their things, Mike suddenly froze, staring at the ground just outside his tent. He pointed to the ground, where the others hurried over, their hearts pounding in their chests. There, in the soft earth around the tents, were footprints, large, deep, and unmistakably human. The prints circled the entire campsite, as if someone had been watching them all night. But there was something off about them. They were too large, the steps too heavy, as if whatever had made them wasn't entirely human after all. Lily's voice cracked as she urged them to leave. Fear gripped them all as they frantically stuffed their belongings into their bags. The air around them grew colder, and the fog, which had been dissipating with the rising sun, thickened once again, swirling around the campsite with an unnatural force. The temperature dropped sharply, and a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, causing the branches to creak and groan as if they were about to snap. Out of nowhere, a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods. It wasn't an animal sound, there was something more primal about it, something ancient and filled with malice. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the trees, until it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Panic set in as the group realized they were surrounded by something unseen, something that had been stalking them since the night before. They grabbed their bags and started to run, their feet pounding against the forest floor, but the growling followed them, growing closer with every step. As they ran, Chris, who had been at the back of the group, suddenly screamed. The others turned just in time to see him being dragged into the fog by an unseen force, his body disappearing into the mist as his screams were abruptly cut off. Tom shouted after Chris, but there was no response, only the lingering sound of that eerie growl. The group froze in terror, realizing that whatever was out there had just taken one of their own. They had no choice but to keep running, their minds racing with fear and desperation. But no matter how far they ran, the fog followed them, thick and suffocating, obscuring everything around them. The forest, once a place of beauty and peace, had become a twisted nightmare. Just as they thought they were safe, Lily stumbled and fell, her foot caught on something hidden beneath the leaves. Tom and Sarah rushed to help her up, but what they saw made their blood run cold. Beneath her foot was the same set of footprints they had seen earlier, only this time, they were deeper, as if whatever had made them was just moments away. The growl echoed once more, this time so close that they could feel it vibrating in the air around them. Desperate and out of options, they pressed forward, running blindly through the fog. But deep down, they knew that there was no escaping it. Whatever was in these woods wasn't going to let them leave. Escape the shadows, a camp leader's nightmare. The group of campers sat in a circle around the crackling fire, the night air cool and heavy with the scent of pine. The leader of the camp, a seasoned man with gray streaks in his hair, gazed into the flames, his face solemn. He was about to share a story, a memory from his own past, one that had haunted him for years. This was no ordinary tale, but one of darkness, terror, and a night that had changed his life forever. He cleared his throat, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on his face, and began to recount the most terrifying night he had ever experienced. A night when the forest itself seemed to come alive, and the only thing that kept the darkness at bay was the flickering light of the campfire. The leader, whose name was Jack, had been just a teenager when it happened. It was supposed to be a typical camping trip, much like the ones he led now, deep in the heart of a dense forest. The group was small, just a few friends looking for an escape from the pressures of school and the noise of the city. They had set up their camp in a clearing, surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The night began like any other. They had spent the day hiking, exploring the forest, and fishing in a nearby stream. As the sun began to set, they gathered around the fire they had built, laughing and sharing stories as the sky darkened from orange to deep blue. The light of the fire danced on their faces, and the crackling of the wood was the only sound, aside from the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Jack, though young, had always been drawn to the solitude of the woods. He loved the way the forest felt alive, how the trees seemed to whisper secrets to each other, and how the air smelled of earth and leaves. That night, however, there was something different in the air, something he couldn't quite place. It was a feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a tension that seemed to thicken as the night wore on. The moon was full, casting a silver light over the clearing, and the stars were bright and clear against the black sky. The fire burned warmly, and the forest seemed at peace. But as the hours passed, Jack began to notice changes, small at first but growing more pronounced with each passing minute. The laughter around the campfire faded as the others began to feel it too, a creeping sense of unease that settled over the group like a thick fog. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of night creatures, suddenly fell silent. The hoot of the owl was gone, and the chirping of crickets ceased abruptly. Even the wind seemed to stop, leaving the trees standing still and silent, their branches no longer swaying. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Jack's eyes scanned the darkened trees that bordered the clearing. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, and the spaces between the trees became impenetrable black voids. He could feel a presence, something watching them from just beyond the reach of the fire's light. It was a feeling that clawed at his gut, making him want to get up and run, but he didn't dare move. The others, sensing the shift, had grown quiet, their eyes darting nervously around the clearing. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped sharply. What had been a cool night suddenly became freezing, and the fire flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. The cold was unnatural, biting through their jackets and clothes, chilling them to the bone. Jack knew something was terribly wrong, but before he could say anything, the world around them plunged into darkness. It was as if someone had thrown a blanket over the moon and stars. The light that had illuminated the clearing was snuffed out in an instant, leaving only the dim glow of the fire. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on them from all sides. The trees, the sky, even the ground beneath their feet seemed to disappear, swallowed by the black void. Jack's heart raced as he realized they were surrounded by something far beyond their understanding. The fire, once a source of comfort and warmth, now seemed frail and weak against the overwhelming darkness that had enveloped the forest. Jack could barely see his friends' faces, their features distorted by the flickering light that struggled to keep the shadows at bay. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and a deep, unsettling silence settled over the clearing. No one spoke, but the fear was palpable, pressing down on them like a weight. Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but the cold that seeped into his bones made it impossible to calm down. Then, out of the silence, came a sound that sent chills down his spine, a low, guttural whisper, so faint that at first he thought he had imagined it. But as he strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, more distinct, as if it were coming from all directions at once. The words were unintelligible, a dark and ancient language that seemed to twist and coil around the campfire, wrapping the group in its sinister embrace. Jack's eyes darted around the clearing, trying to locate the source of the whispering, but the darkness was too thick, too impenetrable. The fire cast long, twisted shadows that danced on the edges of the clearing, but beyond that, there was nothing, only the void. Suddenly, the fire dimmed, the flames shrinking down to mere embers as if something were sucking the life out of them. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were losing their only source of light, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. His friends huddled closer to the fire, their eyes wide with terror as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The cold intensified, and Jack could see his breath in the air, forming little clouds of mist that quickly disappeared into the void. He felt something brush against his back, a cold, clammy touch that sent a jolt of fear through him. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only the darkness, closing in on them, inch by inch. The whispering reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that seemed to seep into Jack's mind, filling it with images of things he couldn't comprehend, twisted, nightmarish visions of creatures with eyes like burning coals and mouths full of sharp, jagged teeth. He could feel the darkness pressing against his skin, a living, breathing entity that sought to consume them all. Desperation clawed at Jack's chest as he realized they were being hunted by something beyond their understanding, something that thrived in the shadows and fed on fear. He knew they couldn't stay there, couldn't allow the darkness to swallow them whole. But as he looked at his friends, frozen in terror, he knew they were all thinking the same thing: there was nowhere to run. The fire flickered weakly, the last of its light fading away, and Jack knew they were out of time. The darkness was closing in, suffocating them, and soon there would be nothing left but the whispers and the cold, empty void. He could feel it reaching out to him, pulling him into the abyss, and he knew that if he didn't do something, anything, they would all be lost. With the last of his strength, Jack grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it out in front of him, the flames sputtering but still burning. He could feel the darkness recoil slightly, the light keeping it at bay, but it wasn't enough. He needed more time, more light, something to push back the shadows that threatened to consume them all. He knew the fire was dying, but he also knew that it was their only hope. The darkness was relentless, and it would not stop until it had taken everything. Jack had to act, but he didn't know how, and the terror of that realization was almost too much to bear. Jack knew that the flickering light of the fire was the only thing standing between them and the malevolent darkness that pressed in from all sides. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, creeping closer with every second. The whispers, now a constant, droning presence, filled his mind with dread, making it hard to think, to focus on anything other than the encroaching terror. He glanced at his friends, huddled together in fear, their faces pale and eyes wide with horror. They were counting on him, looking to him for guidance, for a way out of this nightmare. But Jack didn't have any answers, only a burning stick in his hand and a deep, primal instinct to survive. As the fire continued to dim, Jack felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let the darkness win, couldn't let it take them. He forced himself to stand, the burning stick held high, and began to circle the fire, trying to push back the shadows that threatened to engulf them. The darkness seemed to retreat slightly, the light casting jagged, wavering beams into the void, but it wasn't enough. The fire was dying too quickly, and with it, their only hope of survival. In a moment of clarity, Jack realized what he had to do. He called out to his friends, his voice hoarse but filled with urgency, telling them to gather whatever they could find to keep the fire alive: wood, leaves, anything that would burn. They scrambled into action, their fear momentarily forgotten as they worked to collect anything that might fuel the flames. But the darkness was relentless. It closed in around them, the whispers growing louder, more aggressive, as if angered by their resistance. Jack could feel the cold creeping closer, numbing his fingers, his toes, making it harder to move, to breathe. His heart pounded in his chest as he threw the collected wood onto the fire, watching as the flames sputtered and struggled to catch. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. The fire barely responded, its light too weak to push back the darkness that now surrounded them completely. Jack could see nothing beyond the flickering flames, not the trees, not the sky, nothing but a wall of impenetrable blackness that seemed to be alive with a sinister, pulsing energy. But then, as if by some miracle, the flames began to grow. Slowly at first, but then with increasing intensity, the fire caught hold of the dry wood and leaves, flaring up with a burst of light and heat. The darkness recoiled, retreating slightly, its oppressive weight lifting just enough for them to breathe again. Jack felt a glimmer of hope. The fire was their salvation, the only thing keeping the malevolent forces at bay. But even as the flames grew, he knew they couldn't stay there forever. The darkness wasn't gone, it was only pushed back, waiting for its chance to strike again. He had to get them out of the clearing, away from this place where the darkness was strongest. With the fire burning brighter, Jack grabbed a larger branch from the pile and thrust it into the flames, creating a makeshift torch. The others followed his lead, each grabbing a torch of their own, the flames flickering as they prepared to leave the safety of the fire. Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He didn't know what waited for them beyond the light of the campfire, but he knew they couldn't stay. They had to move, to keep the darkness at bay as long as they could, and hope that they would find their way out of the forest before the fire died again. With one last glance at the now roaring fire, Jack led his friends away from the clearing, their torches held high. The darkness pressed in around them, but the light of the flames kept it at bay, at least for now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whispers began to fade, replaced by the sound of their own breathing and the crackle of the burning wood. But Jack knew the danger wasn't over. The darkness was still there, lurking just beyond the reach of the flames, waiting for its chance to strike. They had to keep moving, had to find a way out before the torches burned out and they were left defenseless. The night stretched on, the forest a maze of shadows and light as they pressed forward. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept going, driven by a determination to protect his friends, to survive the night and escape the darkness that had almost claimed them. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged from the dense forest into a clearing bathed in the pale light of dawn. The sun's rays were weak but growing stronger, pushing back the remnants of the night and the darkness that had haunted them. Exhausted and trembling, they collapsed onto the ground, their torches flickering out as the first light of day washed over them. They had survived the night, but Jack knew that the memory of what had happened would stay with them forever. The darkness that had almost consumed them was no ordinary shadow, no simple trick of the mind. It was something ancient, something evil that had claimed that part of the forest as its own. And though they had escaped, Jack knew it would always be there, waiting for the next unfortunate soul who wandered too close to the heart of the woods. The night they came, an alien encounter in the woods. The campfire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced around the circle of campers. The night was still, the sky clear and filled with stars, the perfect backdrop for sharing ghost stories. One by one, they took turns telling tales of haunted houses, mysterious creatures, and unexplained phenomena. But when it was Dave's turn, he hesitated, a shadow crossing his face. He had a story, one that was unlike any other they had heard that night. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters, but something far more unsettling. It was a story about an encounter he had years ago during a camping trip, an encounter with something not of this world. As the others leaned in, eager to hear more, Dave began to recount the night he came face to face with beings from beyond the stars. Dave had always been an outdoor enthusiast, loving the peace and solitude that only a night under the stars could provide. It was during one of these trips, deep in a secluded forest far from any town or city, that he experienced something that would haunt him forever. The campsite was perfect, nestled among tall trees with a small stream nearby. The group of friends he was with had spent the day hiking, swimming, and exploring, and by the time night fell, they were exhausted and ready to relax around the fire. The night was calm, with a cool breeze rustling through the leaves. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling brightly overhead, and a crescent moon cast a pale light over the forest. After sharing stories and roasting marshmallows, the group began to drift off to their tents, one by one. Dave was the last to turn in, feeling too energized to sleep just yet. He sat by the dying fire, staring up at the stars, his mind wandering. It was during these quiet moments that he felt most connected to the world around him, the vastness of the universe making him feel both insignificant and part of something greater. Eventually, nature called, and Dave stood up, grabbing a flashlight from his bag. Not wanting to disturb the others, he ventured a little way into the woods, where he could take care of business in peace. The forest was eerily silent, the usual night sounds seeming to fade away the deeper he went. The only noise was the crunch of leaves under his boots and the occasional snap of a twig. He found a spot that seemed far enough from the campsite, turned off his flashlight to let his eyes adjust to the dark, and began to relieve himself. As he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air around him felt charged, almost electric, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. A sense of unease settled over him, but he brushed it off as nerves from being alone in the dark. But then, something strange happened. The forest, which had been dimly lit by the moon and stars, suddenly became pitch black. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, plunging the entire area into complete darkness. Dave looked up, expecting to see clouds covering the sky, but the stars were gone, the moon obscured by something massive. Panic began to set in as he fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling. When he finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, but it felt weak, almost useless against the inky blackness that surrounded him. He quickly finished his business and turned to head back to camp, but the path seemed different, unfamiliar. The trees, which had been mere silhouettes moments ago, now loomed over him like giants, their branches reaching out as if to grab him. That's when he heard it, a low, humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, making his skin tingle. It was coming from above, from the source of the darkness that had swallowed the sky. Dave's heart raced as he slowly looked up, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The flashlight's beam wavered as Dave directed it toward the sky, but it was swallowed by the darkness above, revealing nothing. The low hum grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, something massive and powerful hovering just beyond the reach of his vision. The air around him felt charged, as if a storm were about to break, but the sky remained eerily clear of any clouds. Dave's breath caught in his throat as he strained to see what was above him. His heart pounded in his chest, the cold fingers of fear gripping him tightly. The humming intensified, pulsing in a rhythmic pattern that felt almost hypnotic, pulling him into its strange, otherworldly cadence. The trees around him seemed to fade into the background, their towering forms becoming mere shadows as the presence above consumed his attention. Suddenly, a blinding light burst from the darkness, shining directly down on him. It was a harsh, white light, impossibly bright and cold, yet it cast no shadows. Dave was frozen in place, his limbs heavy and unresponsive as the light enveloped him. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, crackling with a force that made his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. Panic surged through him, but his body refused to move. It was as if the light had locked him in place, holding him in a grip that was both invisible and unbreakable. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the terror that coursed through him made it impossible to think clearly. All he knew was that he was not alone, that something far beyond his understanding had found him, and it was not of this world. The light grew even brighter, its intensity almost unbearable, and the humming sound reached a fever pitch, drowning out everything else. Dave felt as though he was being lifted off the ground, his feet no longer rooted to the earth, but suspended in the air by some unseen force. His body felt weightless, detached from the reality he had known moments before, as if he were being pulled away from the world he understood into something far darker and more alien. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light blinked out, plunging the forest back into darkness. The humming ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, and Dave's body dropped to the ground with a thud, the wind knocked out of him by the impact. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his ears, his body trembling with shock. When he finally managed to sit up, the world around him had returned to normal. The stars were visible again, twinkling innocently in the night sky, and the moon cast a soft glow over the forest. The darkness that had swallowed the sky was gone, leaving no trace of the light or the presence that had descended upon him. Dave scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. He looked around frantically, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the forest was as quiet and still as it had been before. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirp of crickets, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Dave knew better. He could still feel the tingling sensation on his skin, the residual energy from whatever had just occurred. His mind raced with questions. What had he seen? What had that light been? And most terrifying of all, what had it wanted with him? He stumbled back toward the campsite, his heart racing, every shadow and sound now filled with potential danger. His friends were still asleep, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded in the woods. But Dave knew he would never forget what had happened, an encounter with something beyond human comprehension, something that had reached out from the stars and touched him in the darkest corner of the forest. When Dave finally stumbled back into the campsite, the fire had burned low, casting only a faint glow on the tents. His friends were still sound asleep, unaware of the terror he had just endured. The calmness of the camp stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had gripped him only moments before. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his heart still racing, as he tried to process what had just happened. He wanted to wake his friends, to tell them about the light, the humming, the paralyzing fear that had seized him. But as he looked at their peaceful faces, he hesitated. How could he explain something that he barely understood himself? They would never believe him, and even if they did, what could they do about it? The encounter felt too surreal, too otherworldly to share. It was as if he had crossed into a realm that no one else could ever comprehend. Dave sat down on a log near the fire, staring into the dying embers. His hands were still trembling, and he could feel the lingering charge in the air, as if whatever had visited him was still close by, watching. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual night sounds eerily absent. The only thing he could hear was the rapid thumping of his own heartbeat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world was no longer the same place it had been when he first walked into those woods. The light, the presence, it wasn't something from Earth. He knew that now, with a certainty that chilled him to his core. What terrified him most was the realization that he had been marked, somehow chosen by whatever force had been out there. He didn't know why, but the thought filled him with a dread unlike anything he had ever known. The minutes dragged on, and slowly, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving him feeling drained and hollow. The forest remained still, as if it too had been affected by the encounter. The darkness that had enveloped him was gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Dave forced himself to his feet. His body ached, and his mind was foggy with exhaustion, but he knew he couldn't stay in the woods any longer. The others were beginning to stir in their tents, oblivious to the events of the night. He needed to get away from the campsite, from the place where his sense of reality had been so violently upended. As his friends emerged, stretching and yawning, Dave forced a smile and began packing up his things. He avoided their questions about why he was up so early, why he looked so pale and shaken. He couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth, not yet. It was too fresh, too raw, and he didn't want to relive it by putting it into words. They left the campsite not long after, the sun climbing higher into the sky, warming the air and chasing away the last vestiges of night. As they hiked back through the forest, Dave couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The forest, bathed in sunlight, looked ordinary again, almost peaceful. But Dave knew better. The events of the night before had opened his eyes to a reality that most people would never see. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He could still feel the presence of the beings he had encountered, as if they had left a part of themselves with him, a reminder that they were out there, watching, waiting. As they reached the edge of the forest and stepped back into the familiar world of roads and cars and civilization, Dave felt a profound sense of relief. But even as they drove away, leaving the woods behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been changed forever. The memory of the light, the hum, and the paralyzing fear would stay with him, a constant reminder of the night he came face to face with something from beyond the stars. The Witch of Loch Naver, a terrifying encounter. The campfire flickered as the night grew darker, casting long shadows that seemed to dance around the circle of campers. It was the perfect setting for sharing stories of terror, and the group was eager to hear the next tale. This time, it was Mark's turn. He was quiet, reserved, not the type to tell ghost stories lightly. But tonight, he had one, a story from his youth that had left him with more than just memories. It had left him with a scar, both physical and psychological. The events took place years ago, during a camping trip in the remote highlands of Scotland, near a mysterious lake known as Loch Naver. The night he encountered the woman in the lake, a woman who was anything but human, was a night that still haunted him to this day. Mark had always been drawn to the solitude of nature, so when he and a group of friends decided to go camping in the Scottish Highlands, he was eager to explore the rugged landscape. They set up camp near Loch Naver, a lake known for its deep, still waters and the ancient legends that surrounded it. The air was crisp, the scent of pine heavy in the air, and the beauty of the highlands was breathtaking. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, where the old world and its myths still held sway. As the day turned to dusk, the group settled around the fire, exchanging stories and enjoying the peace that only a place like this could offer. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling to him from the lake. It was as if the water itself was alive, beckoning him to its shores. After a while, he decided to take a walk, to clear his head and enjoy the quiet. The path to the lake was narrow, winding through the thick trees that bordered the campsite. The further he walked, the quieter it became, until the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. When he reached the edge of the lake, he was struck by its eerie stillness. The water was dark, almost black, reflecting the pale light of the moon that hung low in the sky. A thin mist clung to the surface, swirling gently as if stirred by an invisible hand. For a moment, Mark simply stood there, captivated by the tranquility of the scene. But then, something caught his eye, a figure, moving slowly through the water. He squinted, trying to make out what he was seeing. As the figure drew closer, he realized it was a woman. She moved with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, her long dark hair trailing behind her in the water. Her pale skin glowed faintly in the moonlight, and she seemed completely at ease, as if the cold water didn't affect her at all. Mark was mesmerized. There was something both beautiful and unsettling about her. She didn't seem to notice him at first, or if she did, she gave no indication. She continued to wade through the water, her movements slow and deliberate, almost hypnotic. As she neared the shore, she turned her head slightly, and that's when Mark saw her face. Her eyes were dark, too dark, and they seemed to pierce right through him. Her lips curved into a smile that was anything but friendly, revealing teeth that were sharp, almost pointed. Mark's heart began to race as he realized that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a woman taking a midnight swim, there was something deeply unnatural about her, something that set every instinct in his body on edge. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The woman continued to approach, her eyes locked on his, and he could feel a coldness emanating from her that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the mist thickening, swirling around his legs as if trying to hold him in place. And then, she spoke, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but laced with an underlying menace that sent a shiver down his spine. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized that this was no ordinary woman. He had stumbled upon something ancient, something evil that had been waiting in the depths of the lake for centuries. And now, it had found him. As the woman's voice cut through the silence, Mark felt a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Her words were in a language he didn't recognize, ancient and haunting, but their meaning was clear. They were meant to lure him closer, to draw him into the icy depths of the lake. The soft, almost melodic tone of her voice contrasted sharply with the darkness in her eyes, and he knew, without a doubt, that he was in grave danger. With every step she took, the mist around the lake seemed to thicken, rising higher until it clung to Mark's skin like a cold, damp shroud. The forest that had once been so serene now felt suffocating, as if the trees themselves were closing in, trapping him in this nightmare. The lake, which had appeared so peaceful moments before, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the water rippling unnaturally around the woman as she moved. Mark tried to back away, but his legs felt heavy, as if the mist was holding him in place. Panic began to rise in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he struggled to free himself from whatever force was keeping him there. The woman's smile grew wider, more predatory, as she sensed his fear. Her eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction, and her voice grew louder, more insistent, as if she were casting a spell. The moonlight glinted off something in her hand, a small, ornate dagger that seemed to materialize out of the mist. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as she raised it, the blade catching the light and reflecting it back in 1,000 tiny shards. But it wasn't the dagger that terrified him the most, it was the transformation that began to take place before his eyes. As she stepped out of the water and onto the shore, her body began to change. Her beautiful, ethereal features twisted into something grotesque, something inhuman. Her skin, once smooth and pale, darkened and cracked, like old parchment. Her eyes, once mesmerizing, became hollow pits of darkness, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Mark watched in horror as her long, flowing hair turned into a tangle of writhing, snake-like tendrils, each one hissing and snapping at the air. Her fingers elongated into claws, the nails sharp and pointed like talons. She was no longer the alluring woman he had seen in the water, she had revealed her true form, a demonic witch of the darkest kind. The witch lunged at Mark, faster than he could react. Her clawed hand slashed through the air, aiming for his throat, but he managed to stumble backward just in time, the tip of her claws grazing his neck. Pain seared through him as he felt the sharp sting of the cut, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He knew that if he didn't escape now, he would never leave the lake alive. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Mark turned and ran, the mist swirling around his legs as he fled. The witch let out a screech of fury, a sound so high-pitched and unnatural that it made his ears ring. He could hear her chasing after him, her footsteps unnaturally fast, the mist parting before her as she gained on him. Mark's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, adrenaline fueling his desperate escape. He could see the faint glow of the campfire in the distance, a beacon of safety in the darkness. He knew that if he could just reach it, the light might be enough to keep the witch at bay. But the witch was relentless. He could feel her cold breath on the back of his neck, her claws reaching out for him, the darkness closing in. He was so close to the camp, but every step felt like an eternity, every second bringing her closer. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, driven by pure survival instinct. The campfire was so close now, its flickering light cutting through the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. But with every step he took, the witch grew closer, her guttural screeches echoing in the night, a terrifying reminder that she was right behind him. He could feel her icy breath on his neck, the sharpness of her claws grazing his skin as she reached for him, trying to pull him back into the abyss from which she had emerged. The pain in his neck where she had scratched him earlier flared up, a burning reminder of how close he had come to her grasp. He knew that if she caught him again, there would be no escape. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees blurring together as he ran, his only focus on the light ahead. The campfire, though small, was his last hope, the only thing standing between him and certain death. He could hear the witch's laughter now, a chilling sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees, mocking his desperate attempt to escape. Finally, with one last burst of energy, Mark broke through the tree line and into the clearing where the campfire burned. The sudden change in light was disorienting, but he didn't stop. He threw himself toward the fire, nearly collapsing beside it as he reached the relative safety of the camp. His friends, startled by his sudden appearance and the look of sheer terror on his face, jumped to their feet, shouting in confusion. But Mark didn't have time to explain. He turned back toward the darkened forest, expecting to see the witch emerging from the trees, her grotesque form illuminated by the firelight. But to his shock, she was nowhere to be seen. The forest was silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of his own heart. For a moment, he thought she might have disappeared, that perhaps the light of the fire had driven her back into the lake. But then, he saw it, just beyond the edge of the clearing, hidden in the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes watching him. They were filled with a hatred so intense that it made his blood run cold, but the witch did not move forward. It was as if the light of the fire formed an invisible barrier, one that she could not cross. Mark's friends surrounded him, their voices filled with concern as they asked him what had happened, what had frightened him so badly. But he couldn't find the words to explain the horror he had just escaped. All he could do was point toward the forest, toward those eyes that still watched him from the darkness. Eventually, the eyes disappeared, fading into the night as if they had never been there at all. But the terror did not leave Mark. He could still feel the coldness of the witch's breath on his neck, the sting of her claws on his skin. He reached up to touch the wound on his neck, and his fingers came away slick with blood. The cut was shallow but long, a scar that would remind him of this night for the rest of his life. His friends, realizing the gravity of the situation, quickly stoked the fire, adding more wood to ensure it burned brightly throughout the night. No one slept, they stayed huddled together around the fire, their eyes darting nervously toward the forest, half expecting the witch to return. But she didn't. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, and when dawn finally broke, they packed up their camp in a hurry, eager to leave the haunted shores of Loch Naver behind. As they left, Mark couldn't help but look back one last time at the lake, its surface now calm and peaceful in the morning light. But he knew the truth, that beneath those still waters, something dark and ancient waited, something that had come terrifyingly close to claiming him. The scar on his neck throbbed as a reminder of that night, a mark left by the witch of Loch Naver, a creature who would forever haunt his nightmares. Spirit in the shadows, the curse of the forgotten cabin. The wind began to shake the trees, their branches creaking under the weight of the night. The campers sat huddled close to the fire, their faces lit by its flickering glow, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over them. The evening had taken on an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was listening. Ethan, who had been silent most of the night, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity to his tone that made the others fall silent. He had a story to tell, one that had stayed with him for years, a tale of a night in the woods when he found more than just the firewood he had set out to collect. As he began to recount the events, the others leaned in, their unease growing with every word. It had been a warm summer evening when Ethan and his friends set out on their camping trip deep in the woods. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor as they made their way to a clearing where they planned to set up camp. The air was filled with the scent of pine and earth, and the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was the perfect setting for a weekend of relaxation, away from the noise and stress of the city. As they reached the clearing, the group quickly set up their tents and built a fire. The light from the flames flickered across the trees, casting strange, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. The forest was dense, the trees thick and tall, and as night fell, the darkness between them became almost impenetrable. Despite the peaceful surroundings, there was an undercurrent of unease that Ethan couldn't quite shake. After a while, they realized they needed more firewood to keep the flames burning through the night. Eager to be helpful, Ethan volunteered to go out and gather some. He grabbed a flashlight and headed off into the woods, following a narrow path that wound its way deeper into the forest. The further he went, the quieter it became, the sounds of his friends laughing and talking around the fire growing more distant with each step. The path twisted and turned, the trees closing in around him as the light from his flashlight caught through the darkness. He kept his eyes on the ground, searching for fallen branches and twigs to collect. But as he walked, he noticed something strange, a faint, warm glow ahead of him, just beyond the trees. curious and slightly unnerved, he decided to investigate. As he pushed through the undergrowth, the source of the light became clear. It was a small cabin, nestled deep within the woods. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, but the warm light spilling out from its windows made it seem inviting. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but his curiosity got the better of him. When he reached the cabin, he knocked on the door, half expecting no answer. To his surprise, the door creaked open, and an old man stood there, his face lined with age but his eyes sharp and bright. The man smiled warmly, welcoming Ethan in, and asked what had brought him so deep into the woods. Ethan explained that he was collecting firewood for his campsite, and the old man offered to help, insisting that he had plenty of wood to spare. Relieved and thankful, Ethan followed the old man inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and shelves lined with jars of preserved food and other supplies. The old man led him to a pile of neatly stacked firewood in the corner, helping him gather what he needed. As they worked, the man told Ethan stories of the forest, tales of the old days when the woods were full of life and people would come from miles around to camp and hunt. Ethan felt at ease with the old man, grateful for his help. After they had collected enough wood, the man showed him a quicker path back to the campsite, one that cut straight through the trees and would get him back to his friends in no time. Ethan thanked him, loaded up his bundle of wood, and made his way back, feeling a strange sense of comfort knowing there was someone else out there in the woods. But as he reached the edge of the clearing and saw the firelight flickering in the distance, that sense of comfort began to fade. Something about the encounter didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Pushing the thought aside, he rejoined his friends, who were relieved to see him return safely. Little did he know that the night was far from over, and the real horror was yet to come. The fire crackled warmly as Ethan returned to the campsite, the bundle of firewood in his arms. His friends greeted him with relieved smiles, unaware of the strange encounter he had just experienced. Ethan forced a smile, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him, and set about adding the wood to the fire. The flames flared up, casting long shadows across the clearing as the group settled back into their conversations. As the night deepened, the forest around them grew darker, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the gloom. The fire was the only source of light, its flickering glow barely reaching the edges of the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and pine, and the sounds of the night creatures seemed to grow louder, their calls echoing through the trees. Ethan tried to relax, but his mind kept drifting back to the old man in the cabin. There was something about him that didn't make sense, something that nagged at the back of his mind. The man had been kind, even helpful, but the way he had appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the forest, in a cabin that Ethan was sure hadn't been there before, was unsettling. The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. As the night wore on, the group grew quieter, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the peacefulness of the surroundings. But just as they were beginning to think about turning in for the night, a rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing. The group froze, their eyes snapping to the darkened forest. The rustling grew louder, closer, until finally, a figure stepped into the light. It was the old man from the cabin. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The man hadn't mentioned anything about coming to the campsite, and there was no reason for him to be there. But there he was, standing just outside the ring of light cast by the fire, his face partially hidden in shadow. The others stared at the man in confusion, their expressions turning to concern as they noticed the look on Ethan's face. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear as he took in the old man's presence. The man smiled, a strange, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes, and took a step closer to the fire. "Who's that?" one of Ethan's friends whispered, breaking the tense silence. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He couldn't understand why the man was there, why he had followed him back to the campsite. The unease that had been simmering in his gut turned to cold, hard fear as the man continued to smile, his eyes locked on Ethan. The old man finally spoke, his voice low and calm. He said he had come to make sure Ethan had found his way back safely, that he had wanted to check on him. But there was something off about his tone, something that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. The man's presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong there, like he was something other than what he appeared to be. Ethan's friends exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension in the air. The old man's gaze never wavered from Ethan, his smile never faltered. It was as if he was waiting for something, something that only Ethan could provide. Just as the tension became unbearable, one of Ethan's friends spoke up, inviting the old man to sit by the fire and warm himself. But the man shook his head, his smile fading slightly. He said he couldn't stay, that he had to return to his cabin before it got too late. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees as quickly and silently as he had appeared. The group was left in stunned silence, the warmth of the fire suddenly feeling cold and distant. Ethan's mind raced, his fear growing with each passing moment. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't understand what it was. All he knew was that the man's presence had brought a darkness with it, a darkness that still lingered in the air around them. As the night dragged on, they all agreed to keep the fire burning bright until morning. No one wanted to admit it, but they were all terrified that the man might return, or that something worse might come in his place. Morning came slowly, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon and filtering through the trees. The group of campers had barely slept, their nerves frayed from the unsettling encounter the night before. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the early light. The cold, damp air of the forest clung to them as they stirred, exchanging uneasy glances as they began to pack up their gear. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he replayed the events of the previous night in his mind. The old man's appearance had been so strange, so out of place, that he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. His friends, though trying to put on brave faces, seemed just as unsettled. They spoke in hushed tones, their laughter from the day before replaced by uneasy whispers. As they packed, one of the campers suggested they take a quick trip back to the cabin to thank the old man for his help. Perhaps seeing the place in the daylight would ease their minds, they reasoned. Reluctantly, Ethan agreed, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave the forest as quickly as possible. There was something about the cabin that he needed to understand, something that felt unfinished. The group followed the path Ethan had taken the night before, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves that littered the ground. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but still heavy with the weight of what had happened. The birds were singing again, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled light on the forest floor. But despite the beauty of the morning, a sense of foreboding hung over them. When they reached the spot where Ethan had found the cabin, they all froze. The clearing was empty, there was no cabin, no signs that anyone had lived there for years, maybe even decades. The ground where the cabin had stood was overgrown with weeds, and the trees were thick and undisturbed. It was as if the cabin had never existed at all. Ethan's heart raced as he walked forward, his eyes scanning the area. He could still picture the cabin in his mind, the warmth of the fire inside, the old man's kind but unsettling smile. But now, in the harsh light of day, it was clear that something was horribly wrong. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, the old man hadn't been real, or at least, not in the way they had thought. He was something else, something tied to this place, something that had been lost to time. One of the campers called out, pointing to a half-buried stone near the center of the clearing. As they brushed away the dirt and leaves, they revealed what looked like an old, weathered gravestone, its surface cracked and covered in moss. The inscription was barely legible, worn away by years of exposure to the elements, but they could just make out the name and date, John McCrae, 1823 to 1887. Ethan's blood ran cold. The old man had been a spirit, trapped in the place where he had once lived, doomed to wander the woods near his long-forgotten home. The cabin had been a ghostly echo, a remnant of the past that only appeared under certain conditions, perhaps when someone like Ethan stumbled too close. The realization that they had been in the presence of a spirit sent a wave of fear through the group. They quickly backed away from the clearing, the eerie stillness of the forest now taking on a sinister edge. No one spoke as they hurried back to their campsite, the air thick with tension and the fear of what they had just uncovered. When they returned to the camp, they found it exactly as they had left it, but the feeling of unease lingered. The fire was out, the tents packed up, and the forest around them seemed to watch in silence as they prepared to leave. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the old man was still out there, watching them from the shadows, waiting for another chance to guide some unsuspecting camper to his ghostly cabin. As they left the forest behind, the weight of the encounter stayed with them. They had come face to face with something beyond their understanding, something that would remain with them long after they had returned to the safety of their everyday lives. And for Ethan, the scar left by the old man's eerie presence would never fully heal, a constant reminder of the night he had met a ghost in the heart of the woods. Lost in the shadows, the cave that devoured the dogs. They had already shared several stories, each one more chilling than the last, but when Leonardo, a former military combatant, began to speak, a hush fell over the group. His voice was steady, but there was a gravity to his tone that commanded their attention. This was no ordinary campfire tale. It was a story from his past, one that had haunted him for years. A story of a night on a remote mountain, where he and his team had encountered something far beyond the realm of the natural. As he began to recount the terrifying events that unfolded in a small cave hidden deep within the mountain, the campers leaned in, their breath held in anticipation of the horror that was about to be revealed. Leonardo and his team of experienced hikers had set out on what was supposed to be a routine camping trip in the remote mountains of Montana. The group, consisting of Leonardo, 2 of his former military buddies, and 3 avid hunters, had been planning this trip for months. They were well prepared, equipped with all the necessary gear, and accompanied by 2 trained hunting dogs to help them navigate the rugged terrain. The journey to the mountain's peak was challenging, but the breathtaking views made the effort worthwhile. The air was crisp and clean, the sky clear and bright. It seemed like the perfect day for an adventure. But as they neared the summit, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of impending rain. Determined to reach their destination before the weather turned, the group pressed on. The trail became steeper, more treacherous, and soon the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time they reached the top, the storm had fully arrived, the rain coming down in sheets, drenching them to the bone. It was then that one of the hunters spotted a small opening in the rock face, a cave, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The entrance was narrow, barely visible from the trail, but it offered shelter from the storm. The group quickly agreed to take refuge inside, at least until the worst of the rain had passed. As they entered the cave, the air inside was cool and damp, carrying the musty smell of earth and stone. The space was cramped, barely large enough for all 6 men and the 2 dogs. They lit their flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness, revealing the interior of the cave. What they saw made their blood run cold. The walls of the cave were covered in strange, ancient symbols, carved deep into the stone. The symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen, their shapes jagged and chaotic, as if etched by some malevolent force. Scattered across the floor were bones, human bones, bleached white with age. Skulls, rib cages, and femurs lay in disarray, some partially buried in the dirt, others piled haphazardly against the walls. A sense of unease settled over the group. They had expected to find nothing more than an empty cave, a simple shelter from the storm. But what they had stumbled upon was something far more sinister. Leonardo felt a chill run down his spine as he took in the scene, his instincts screaming that they should leave immediately. But the rain outside had turned into a torrential downpour, and the wind was howling like a banshee. The cave, unsettling as it was, offered the only protection they had from the elements. Reluctantly, they decided to stay, setting up their gear as best they could in the cramped space. The dogs, usually calm and obedient, were restless, their ears pricked and their eyes darting nervously around the cave. As night fell, the atmosphere inside the cave grew heavy with tension. The rain pounded against the mountainside, the sound amplified by the cave's acoustics, creating an almost deafening roar. The flickering light of their flashlights cast strange, shifting shadows on the walls, making the symbols seem to dance and writhe. Leonardo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The others felt it too, their conversations growing quieter, more subdued. They were seasoned outdoorsmen, not easily spooked, but there was something about this cave that set their nerves on edge. As the hours passed and the storm showed no sign of letting up, they tried to get some rest. But sleep was elusive, and Leonardo found himself lying awake, his hand resting on the handle of his knife, his senses alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake by staying in the cave, that something terrible was about to happen. As the night wore on, the cave seemed to grow colder, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. The rain outside continued to hammer against the mountain, but it was no longer the storm that held Leonardo's attention. It was the silence within the cave, a silence so profound that it felt almost unnatural, as if the very air had been sucked out, leaving only the sound of their shallow breaths. The hunting dogs, usually so calm and reliable, began to whine softly, their ears pinned back and their eyes wide with fear. They huddled close to the men, their bodies trembling as if they could sense something that the others could not. Leonardo, ever vigilant, felt the unease in his gut turn into something far more primal, a deep, gnawing fear that clawed at the edges of his mind. Suddenly, one of the dogs let out a low, guttural growl, its hackles rising as it stared intently at the darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. The other dog quickly followed suit, both of them now on high alert, their growls growing louder, more insistent. The men, sensing the change in the dog's behavior, sat up, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Leonardo's heart raced as he scanned the cave, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, their jagged lines twisting and contorting in the flickering light. The bones scattered across the floor appeared to shift, as if something beneath them was stirring, ready to rise. And then they heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the soft rustling of fabric or the whisper of a distant voice. It echoed through the cave, bouncing off the walls and growing louder with each passing second. The sound was not natural, it was otherworldly, carrying with it a sense of ancient malice that sent chills down their spines. Leonardo's training kicked in, and he motioned for the others to stay silent. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them, closing in. The dogs began to bark frantically, their voices filled with panic as they backed away from the darkness, their eyes fixed on something unseen. Without warning, the temperature in the cave plummeted, the air becoming frigid and biting. Their breath came out in visible puffs, and a layer of frost began to form on the walls and floor. The men exchanged nervous glances, their fear now palpable, their minds racing with questions they couldn't answer. Then, from the depths of the cave, they saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes, staring at them from the darkness. The eyes were set in a face that was almost human, but twisted and deformed, its features contorted in a grotesque expression of rage and hunger. The creature's body was shrouded in shadows, but they could see its clawed hands, sharp and deadly, reaching out toward them. The men froze, their eyes locked on the demonic figure as it slowly advanced, its movements deliberate and predatory. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble as the creature approached. Leonardo knew they had to act fast. He shouted orders to his team, his voice cutting through the paralysis that had gripped them. They grabbed their weapons and prepared to defend themselves, but Leonardo knew that bullets and knives wouldn't be enough to stop whatever this thing was. They needed to get out, now. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech, its voice filled with a hatred so pure that it made the walls of the cave vibrate. The dogs barked furiously, lunging at the creature, but it swatted them away with a single swipe of its clawed hand, sending them flying across the cave. The men opened fire, the gunshots deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullets seemed to have little effect, passing through the creature as if it were made of smoke. Leonardo didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed his gear and shouted for the others to follow him. They bolted for the cave entrance, the creature's screeches echoing behind them as it gave chase. The dogs, disoriented and wounded, struggled to keep up, their howls of pain mixing with the demonic cries that filled the night. They burst out of the cave and into the pouring rain, the cold water stinging their skin as they stumbled down the mountainside. Leonardo kept his eyes on the path ahead, refusing to look back, even as the screeches grew louder, closer, as if the creature was right on their heels. The rain had turned the ground into a slippery mess, and they struggled to keep their footing as they raced against the storm. But as they reached the edge of the forest, the screeches suddenly stopped. The air was still, the only sound the rain pattering against the leaves. Leonardo skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he listened, his heart pounding in his ears. The others came to a stop beside him, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were safe, for now. But as they caught their breath, they realized something terrible: the dogs were gone. The last they had heard of them was their desperate howls as they tried to escape the cave. Now, all that remained was the memory of their cries, lost to the mountain and the horrors that lurked within. Leonardo clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he scanned the darkness. He knew that whatever had been in that cave was no longer following them, but the loss of the dogs cut deep. They had been loyal, brave, and they had paid the ultimate price. The group began the long, treacherous descent down the mountain, their spirits broken by the encounter. The rain continued to pour, and as they made their way back to civilization, the only sound that haunted Leonardo's mind was the distant echo of the dogs' final, mournful howls, swallowed by the darkness of the mountain forever. The descent down the mountain was a harrowing ordeal. The rain had turned the narrow paths into slippery trails of mud, and every step felt treacherous. Leonardo led the group, his mind still reeling from the events in the cave, but his training kept him focused on getting his team to safety. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around them, the thick canopy of trees blocking out any hint of moonlight, leaving only the dim glow of their flashlights to guide their way. The group moved in silence, the weight of what they had just experienced pressing down on them. No one dared to speak, as if fearing that even the softest whisper might draw the attention of the demonic entity they had encountered. The only sound was the constant drumming of the rain and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The air was thick with tension, each of them acutely aware of the absence of the hunting dogs that had been their companions. Leonardo's thoughts kept drifting back to those final moments in the cave, the glowing red eyes, the inhuman screeches, and the way the creature had effortlessly brushed aside their weapons. He had faced many dangers in his military career, but nothing had prepared him for this. The loss of the dogs weighed heavily on him. They had been more than just animals, they had been part of the team, and now they were gone, taken by something that defied all logic and reason. As they continued down the mountain, the terrain grew more difficult to navigate. The steep slopes and uneven ground made every step precarious, and more than once, someone slipped and had to be helped back to their feet. Despite the physical exhaustion, Leonardo pushed them onward, driven by the need to put as much distance between them and the cave as possible. Hours passed, and the storm began to lose its fury, the rain easing into a steady drizzle. The forest, once filled with the sounds of wildlife, was now eerily quiet. The only noises were the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the labored breathing of the men. Leonardo kept his eyes forward, his senses on high alert for any sign of danger. But as they neared the base of the mountain, a different kind of unease began to settle over him, a gnawing sense that they were not alone. The path ahead seemed to twist and turn more than it should, the trees appearing closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, despite the rain letting up, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their vision. Leonardo's grip tightened on his flashlight as he scanned the mist, searching for any sign of movement. Then, faint but unmistakable, he heard it, the sound of a dog howling. It was distant, barely audible over the muffled sounds of the forest, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. The others halted too, their eyes widening as they strained to listen. The howling came again, this time closer, and it was soon joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with the haunting cries of the lost dogs. Leonardo's heart raced. The howls were filled with an anguish that sent shivers down his spine, as if the dogs were trapped in some unseen torment. He felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to search for them, but he knew it was impossible. The dogs were gone, lost to whatever malevolent force dwelled in the cave. They could not be saved. But the howling continued, growing louder, echoing through the misty forest. It was as if the dogs were calling out to them, begging them to return. The sound was unbearable, a piercing reminder of their loss, and it tugged at Leonardo's resolve. He wanted nothing more than to run, to flee from the noise that tore at his heart, but he couldn't. Not yet. Finally, the howls began to fade, growing fainter until they were nothing more than distant echoes, swallowed by the fog. The group stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, until Leonardo finally turned to them, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "We have to keep moving," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We can't stay here." With heavy hearts, they resumed their descent, the fog wrapping around them like a shroud. The forest seemed endless, the path twisting and turning in ways that made them feel as if they were walking in circles. But Leonardo's determination never wavered. He led them onward, one foot in front of the other, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the outline of a road came into view. Relief washed over the group as they stumbled onto the road, their bodies aching from the ordeal. The first light of dawn was beginning to break through the fog, casting a pale glow on the wet asphalt. They were safe, at last. But even as they reached the safety of civilization, the memory of the night lingered. The cave, the creature, the lost dogs, these were things they would never forget. Leonardo knew that the mountain held secrets far darker than they could ever comprehend, and though they had escaped with their lives, they had left something behind in those cursed woods. As they drove away, the fog slowly lifting, Leonardo cast one last glance at the mountain. The howls of the dogs still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the night he had faced the unknown. He knew that the scar left by that night would never heal, a permanent mark on his soul. And though they had escaped, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain wasn't done with them yet. The campfire stories you've just heard are more than mere tales of terror, they are glimpses into the unexplained and unsettling mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our world. From the lost spirit in an ancient cabin to the terrifying encounter with demonic beings in a forgotten mountain cave, each story offers a chilling reminder of the unknown dangers that might be hiding just beneath the surface. We've witnessed how an encounter with a witch in a lake can forever change a camper's life and how an experienced leader faced a darkness so deep that even his hunting dogs vanished without a trace. These stories remind us that even in the most remote and peaceful places, the unknown can be lurking. So, what would you do if you found yourself in their place? Do you have a scary or unexplained camping story that you'd like to share? Send in your story, and it might just appear in our next video. I'd love to know which of these stories sent chills down your spine the most. And which one do you think deserves a like on this video? Don't forget to comment below and share your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed to the Deep channel yet, now is the time, subscribe for more stories that will keep you up at night. Until next time, remember, what hides in the shadows isn't always just a shadow.